Welcome back to the channel. Today we're traveling back to the Middle Ages to uncover the do's and don'ts of surviving a plague. Stay with us till the end to discover some of the most outlandish survival tactics you've never heard of. Chapter 1. The Unwelcome Visitor. In the year 1347 in Europe, a seemingly ordinary ship docks, but among its cargo is a stowaway destined to change history, the Black Death. Within days, the bustling port becomes ground zero for an outbreak that will eventually claim up to 200 million lives across Europe. Originating from the steppes of Asia, transported by the fleas on black rats aboard countless merchant ships, this plague was an unseen force of nature, sweeping through towns and cities with merciless speed. Faced with the world's deadliest party crasher, what would you do? Let's dive into the medieval playbook and explore how our ancestors tried to survive this merciless invader. So, what's your move? Run? Hide? Bathe in vinegar? Oh, we'll get to that. Chapter 2. The Ravages of the Black Death. Symptoms and Suffering. Before we meet the eerie figures known as plague doctors, let's understand the enemy they faced. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, unleashed a horrific array of symptoms on its victims. Within days of infection, a person might exhibit swellings or buboes, painfully enlarged lymph nodes, which appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes could turn black, burst open, and ooze pus and blood. Fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains, and in many cases a swift demise followed. The speed and brutality of the disease left cities paralyzed with fear and desperation. Understanding the gruesome nature of the plague helps us appreciate the monumental task faced by those who dared to treat it. Now, let's explore who these brave or perhaps foolhardy individuals were, the plague doctors. Chapter 3. The Plague Doctors, Medicine or Myth? Now that we've seen how the Black Death crept into Europe, let's look at how people tried to fight back. In the 14th century, doctors, healers, and even barbers stepped up to try their hand at treating the plague, but it was more desperation than science. The medical professionals of the day ranged from barber surgeons who performed bloodletting to balance the humours to local healers offering herbal concoctions and potions. Apothecaries sold anything from theriac, a cure-all remedy containing dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, to pungent herbs that were thought to fend off the so-called bad air carrying the disease. But as you might guess, none of these treatments actually helped much. And what about the iconic beak-masked plague doctor, you ask? Despite what popular culture might suggest, those eerie bird-like masks weren't around during the Black Death. The familiar beak mask and leather suit we associate with plague doctors today actually didn't appear until the 17th century, designed by Charles de Lorme for later outbreaks. The mask was stuffed with herbs like lavender, mint, and camphor, which were believed to filter out the miasma, or bad air, thought to spread disease. In reality, much of the battle against the Black Death was fought through community efforts. Families burned herbs in their homes, avoided the sick, or even fled cities altogether. These small, often desperate measures formed the backbone of the medieval medical response, a mix of tradition, hope, and sheer survival instinct. Chapter 4. Quarantine and Isolation. As the Black Death tore through Europe, communities began to recognize a harsh reality. Being close to others meant risking infection. But what could be done? With limited medical knowledge and no concept of germs, people turned to drastic measures, quarantine and isolation. The word quarantine actually comes from this time, stemming from the Italian word quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. In the 14th century, the city of Venice, a major trading hub, faced wave after wave of the plague arriving with merchants and sailors from abroad. To curb the spread, Venetian authorities ordered ships suspected of carrying the disease to anchor in the lagoon for 40 days before anyone could set foot on land. This 40-day waiting period became known as quarantine and would lay the groundwork for future disease control. Venice's quarantine measures soon inspired other cities. Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, was one of the first to implement formalized quarantine in 1377, requiring travelers to stay at a remote island for a full month before they could enter the city. Other cities like Milan closed their gates entirely to those suspected of carrying the plague, with guards stationed to keep strangers out. Chapter 5: Everyone's at risk. The Black Death didn't discriminate. Whether you were a humble peasant working the fields or a monarch ruling a kingdom, the plague could come for you just the same. In fact, one of the most terrifying aspects of the Black Death was its power to level society, infecting people from all walks of life and undermining the social hierarchy that defined medieval Europe. Peasants living in cramped quarters were especially vulnerable. With poor sanitation, close proximity, and little medical help, entire villages were wiped out in a matter of days. For common folk, survival was often a matter of pure chance. But it wasn't just the poor who suffered. Even the noble classes and royalty weren't safe. Lords and ladies could retreat to their isolated estates, but their attendants, cooks, and guards still brought risk. Many noble families saw members perish, and some rulers, like King Alfonso XI of Castile, succumbed to the plague. The Black Death was a humbling reminder that wealth and status couldn't protect you from nature's deadliest forces. Chapter 6: Faith, Fear, and Folklore. When science fell short, people turned to faith, fear, and folklore to survive the plague. Medieval society was deeply religious, and in the absence of medical answers, people believed that divine intervention, or protection from supernatural forces, was their best hope. One of the most popular remedies against the plague was to wear religious amulets and charms. These trinkets, blessed by priests or thought to have divine power, were believed to offer protection from disease. Some people wore saints' medals or carried a small pouch filled with herbs like rosemary, believed to ward off evil spirits and bad air. The smell of herbs filled the streets and homes, as burning aromatic plants like juniper and sage was thought to purify the air and drive away the miasma that carried the plague. Families burned these herbs around their homes and even inhaled the smoke as a protective measure. It was an attempt to shield themselves from the invisible enemy. In many towns, people organized religious processions, parading through the streets with crosses and relics, believing they could appease God's wrath. Some believed the plague was a punishment for sins, and entire communities would come together to beg for forgiveness and protection. But these gatherings had the unintended effect of spreading the disease even further. For some, the need for divine protection took an extreme form. Enter the flagellants, a group of devout penitents who believed self-punishment would purify them and spare their souls. They marched from town to town, whipping themselves in the streets to atone for humanity's sins. The sight of these bloodied penitents was both terrifying and hopeful for onlookers who desperately wanted an answer to the plague. But not every solution was grounded in religion. Folklore and superstition also played a part. People were advised to avoid black cats, thought to be carriers of evil, and to be wary of neighbours who might be witches. Suspicion ran high, and the plague fueled a paranoia that often turned people against each other. Chapter 7: The Silver Lining. As devastating as the Black Death was, it left Europe forever changed. In the wake of unimaginable loss came a shift in society, science, and culture that would lay the groundwork for a new era. Sometimes, out of darkness comes the light of transformation. With so many lives lost, labour became scarce, and those who survived found themselves in demand. For the first time, workers could ask for higher wages and better conditions, pushing back against the rigid social hierarchy. This rise in wages and improvement in working conditions helped empower the common folk and marked the beginning of the end of feudalism. Cities and towns began to recover, and the economy gradually rebounded, now shaped by new ideas about fairness and opportunity. The plague's impact wasn't limited to labour, though. It touched nearly every corner of society, forcing communities to rethink old ways of life and start fresh. The lessons of the Black Death remind us of the resilience of humanity. It taught us to adapt, to find hope after loss, and to value the pursuit of knowledge. So, what do you think? Can we learn from the challenges faced centuries ago? Let us know in the comments below.